Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance will include male model popes, penitential tigers, and two culturally irrelevant men talking about irrelevant culture. All this and more on this episode of Created Things.
Greetings and welcome to this episode of Created Things. I'm your co-host, Father Gabriel. I'm a Catholic priest and a perpetual lifelong student, and I'm bringing you my co-host, Jacob Flores Popchak, who is an artist and a psychotherapist, and we bring you today's world's finest installment of the only podcast, as far as I know, that takes place, as in is filmed in and recorded in the belly of a whale.
Yeah, we are literally.
So, Jacob, any thoughts about that?
It doesn't smell as bad as I suspected, and I know that those of you guys watching the video version of this podcast, you might be looking and saying, "Well, Jacob is sitting in kind of a burnt umber armchair, and there are blinds behind Father Gabriel. This cannot possibly be the belly of a whale." You are incorrect there. This whale really likes to eat home goods.
Yeah, it's an interior decoration kind of situation.
Yeah,
you know? I mean,
literally interior decoration.
Yeah, exactly, interior decoration. Jacob, I do, however, have a confession to make, which is that.
Wait, is this a priest confessing to me?
Yes, I'm not in the belly of a whale.
You lied to me?
I know. It's not the strongest start to our relationship, but yes, I'm in a Dominican priory, thus the blinds. But the possibility that this whole thing has been swallowed by a cosmic whale, I am open to, in fact. So
I highly suspect we're going to be discussing cosmic whales today, because our topic, for those of you who perhaps checked out the last episode of Created Things, you'll know that we were breaking down our top favorite guilty pleasures within the arts, terrible movies we love, weird shows that we enjoy, etc., and so forth. Really leaning into this idea that beauty is kind of the fingerprints of God, and that, by kind of observing those things that we uniquely find beautiful, we can learn a little bit about each other, and maybe even by extension about God, and to kind of prove that to ourselves in a silly way. We're looking at the weirdest, goofiest things that we like. Unfortunately, at that point, I was recording in a library in Texas and was kicked out of that library for going too long with their hours. So we had to wrap up after only our respective top two, leaving. Which in the end, I mean, this is very smooth. This is like it's like you're telling this really dramatic story, and then right when you reach the climax, you take a sip. We did that very extended, and then maybe choked and had to go to the hospital and came back a week later, and then we're able to start telling the hilarious story again right where we left off. Nobody noticed. It was so cool. It's dramatic tension. Yeah, dramatic tension.
It's dramatic tension, it's like you start finding out, oh my gosh, my co-hosts are in the belly of a whale. How is this going to happen? Where's this going to end? Then you realize, oh, it's not much dramatic tension. They were just lying terribly. So it's that kind of dramatic tension. I just feel like this is what I seek for in my life.
Right. So today, though, we are talking about each of our number ones in terms of guilty pleasures in the art world. And this is a very exciting topic for me, because I think we're going to get very, very silly. And it's a dangerous thing because, we get allotted ourselves, an hour and change last time to, in theory, talk about all three, only to then talk about, two each. Now we have an hour to fully expand upon just one topic each. This could get very boring.
5 minutes later. Yeah, so that's what I had to say about that. And okay, so peace out.
Yeah, it's either going to be the most slogging episode of our podcast, or it's going to be the weirdly briefest episode of our podcast.
All of the above. Yeah, I'm shooting for it.
Cool.
So, you want to launch into it?
Yeah,
Are
we
you ready?
should.
Are you
Well,
ready to?
I before we launch into it, I did have a question. Last time when we spoke, we were talking about how you and I are almost always in a new place every time we record this thing,
Fact.
which attributed to the fact that we are technically both homeless. Um,
Technically,
yeah,
properly speaking.
right. Yeah, but yeah, I'm living on the road with my wife right now. You are living on the road with the Lord right now. So we're both, doing our cool bohemian millennial thing. Um, Last time you were in, I believe, Arizona. I was in Texas.
Yes.
Where in the world is Father Gabriel now?
I'm in Utah,
Y-
which, just in case you didn't know, is not pronounced Utah. I just wanted to offer that, take that one to just think about it, mull on it.
Yeah, just
But yes,
just
I am in
simmer on
Utah.
that. Put it in your pipe and smoke it.
Yes.
Okay, so here's a
It turns out that you can, by the way, I now know by experience, although I guess I've done it before, but you can drive for like 12 or 13 hours and only be in two states when you're
yeah.
going from Salt Lake City to Phoenix. It's amazing because it's like driving in Texas where you're like, I just drove absolutely all day and I'm still in Texas. So,
Well, that
it's
was exactly the
Western
experience I
states.
had 2 days ago because my wife and I drove from San Antonio, where we were at the time of the last recording, to now Albuquerque, New Mexico. Um,
Nice.
the inspiration for Weird Al's greatest song of all time. But yeah, exactly the same experience. Driving through Texas, and this will inevitably offend some of our listeners, but driving through Texas is, I think, the closest thing I can imagine to driving through purgatory.
Have you ever driven across the Dakotas?
No,
Dark,
yeah.
dark. We talked last time about you were talking about roadside attractions, and I was immediately triggered with this horrifying physical memory of like the 8 hour long torture machine that is the like "Welcome to Wall Drug" signs
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
across the Dakotas. So I have, shall we say, difficult memories of the Dakotas. As you can tell by the fact that I can't even remember which Dakota it is, which is, by the way, I realize extremely offensive because this is like people from the East Coast who can't ever remember that Washington is a different state from Oregon.
Right.
Like,
I
I
do
know
the
they're
same
different
thing.
states.
I do the same thing with the Carolinas. I just say the
Mm.
Carolinas like I'm a 17th century pirate.
Yes, that's good.
I
Yeah,
can't
that's
separate.
good.
People will be
Yes.
like, "Oh, I'm going to
Yar.
such and such beach," and I'm like, "Oh, you're going to the Carolinas."
Yar.
Uh,
There's good gold to be had there, matey.
right, right. This pirate thing works for us with the beards and
Beards, yeah.
the sort of
Yes.
white flowing garments. We're matching today. We're matching today
Oh,
with our
good.
white flowing
Excellent.
garments.
Excellent. Yes. So you've joined a cult? I just outside
Yes.
of a Catholic religious order, the only organization I know that wears white flowing garments is literally every cult ever. I don't know what it is. It's something about it's like in the water. Once you start drinking the personality cult thing, you just have to wear white flowing garments. It's
Well,
very
they
mysterious.
bleach your brain and they want to bleach your clothes too.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah,
Isn't that
it's
beautiful?
sort of a synchronicity kind of a thing, right?
Glorious.
So you mentioned that we talked about roadside attractions last time. Maybe it'd be good if we recapped for everybody what each of our two from last episode were before we jump into what our number ones are respectively.
Excellent. So I'll go first. My number three was
1, 2, 3.
three. Four is right out. Number three was Aqua Teen Hunger Force, the Adult Swim TV show that probably nobody has ever watched since it was on air, except for me, who is obsessed with it. And I confess, I'm not proposing it as exactly the same level of art as my number two, which is the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch.
Right, very diverse, eclectic assortment of things. Mine
Yes.
was slightly less diverse than yours, yet no less weird. I had chosen for my top two Nicolas Cage films. the sincerity of which I have always appreciated, and then, as you mentioned already, roadside attractions, which are always this really hilarious oasis amidst the mundane when you're driving across the country. And we sort of both talked about some of the mysticism we observed there. But enough recapping. I think that this is a fair amount of backstory. I think it's time for you, Father, to introduce us to your number one.
My number one was that was bizarrely kind of Japanesey. This is, by the way, because of having spent like 10 years studying Japanese. Some weird things just get stuck in your mind. Like I literally can't think of the phrase number one without thinking like ichiban. So it's like why every Japanese restaurant you go to is named like either ichiban or like number one. It's because guess what? It says number one in Japanese. This is how you say the best, or it's one of the ways you say the best.
Right.
So this is deep in the mind. So my ichiban favorite thing is Catholic science fiction.
Catholic science fiction is your
Yes.
number one guilty pleasure amidst the arts.
For sure.
Okay.
For sure. Yes, Catholic science fiction.
Okay.
Are you aware that this is a thing? Let's start with that.
Well, so I am proximally aware that this is a thing. I'm aware of maybe 2 or 3 examples, probably closer to 2. I'm probably being generous myself, of what I would consider actually being in that category. And then beyond that, I'm aware of probably between 5 and 8 examples of traditional sci-fi with really solid and interesting Catholic themes. But I'm not sure exactly what your parameters for what you'd consider Catholic sci-fi is, let alone why that would be a guilty pleasure to you. I'm inferring that maybe it's bad, but you love it anyway, just because of the tone of these episodes so far. But I'm interested to have you expound upon this.
Yeah, so it's a great combination of things that are actually good at themselves and worth enjoying on their own rights, on their own merits, and then things that are kind of bad in themselves, but like also worth enjoying on the merits of irony or things like this.
Okay.
It's hard to explain. So, okay, so do I have very strong parameters for defining what I mean by Catholic science fiction? Not exactly, but the basic thing that I mean is sometimes it's fiction written like by a science fiction written by a Catholic. Other times it's written by people from whatever kind of persuasion, but using this very like intense kind of exploration of the Catholicism very specifically and explicitly. Let me back up for just a second and say, so like, what is science fiction? Just briefly.
Oh my goodness,
like,
you're going that far back.
Yeah, well, just real brief is to say that, like, basically the thing with science fiction is it says, like, it's a way of looking at humanity. So it's primarily about if just, say, one thing were different. And that, say, one thing that's different usually has something to do with sort of science and technology or alien life or these kinds of things. So it's going to be more in the realm of the conceivably physically possible than in the realm of the like not conceivably possible, like which would sort of push you more in the realm of like fantasy, etc.
Okay.
So, but the point is that what the question that science fiction is asking is always about the human being, like something about the human experience, what it means to be a human being. And the way in which they want to like and crack into that is by proposing something, a sudden further development along technological lines, or a sudden incursion of alien contact or something like this, to make you understand something about what it means to be human, what it means to be alive. So the first person to do this with a specific angle of trying to use that kind of a lens to understand what it means to be a human being who is in relationship with God, the first person whom I know to do that is Robert Hugh Benson.
Okay.
His book Lord of the World, which is published in 1906, 1907. It's an this is a real literary treasure on its own merits. Just absolutely deserves to be appreciated simply for what it is. Apparently, it's Pope Francis's like favorite book. So he says.
What?
Which
Okay.
it actually kind of makes some sense. You read it. There's some characterizations of the Pope in that book that are like you really understand the kind of like end times mentality that Pope Francis will show evidence of at various times is like pretty strongly represented in this book.
Oh, interesting.
But the basic question there is that so it's the apocalypse. Like spoiler alert, the book ends when time ends, which is a pretty bold way to write a novel.
I mean, yeah, that kind of
and
wraps things up pretty neatly for you, doesn't it?
wraps things up pretty wildly. He then eventually wrote a sequel, which
Oh, God.
you know, yeah. So Robert Hugh Benson is an amazing author. He was a Catholic priest in England. He was an amazing author, but the sequel to Lord of the World seems like it was ill-conceived. But what can you do? So the idea there is that it's the literal apocalypse, and so you have this main character who is this just good priest, and then you have his counterpart who is, you discover, the Antichrist, who even like looks mysteriously exactly like him, but like they don't know each other, and it's, you know, because he's just a little priest, and the Antichrist figure is this is rapidly becoming leader of a one world government, all this kind of stuff.
All the things that would terrify my grandmother.
Yes, exactly. And like so Benson just really has this very fascinating vision about how the technologization of society results in this like dehumanization, and that this dehumanization then like kind of results in people like using each other. And he has this very strong sense of the way in which like the exaltation of technology as the solution to the human being's problems means that you end up with this like double-edged kind of saccharine, sappy notion of people who are just like all about being nice all the time, all about like not offending anybody. But then if somebody offends in a way that the society can't accept, that they are literally ready to tear them to pieces, which in fact happens at one point in the book.
Oh, gross.
So it's fascinating for a ton of reasons. It's written again like 1906, 1907. It's a kind of dystopian book, but written well in advance of World War One.
Oh, interesting.
And every work of dystopian fiction comes out of either World War One or World War Two. It's a fruit of the like unconscionable horror of those wars, that then people begin to think like, what would it be like to basically live in hell but still be on Earth? Because they realize that this is the kind of thing that was unleashed with World War One and World War Two. So Benson's work is unusual, for one, because it's well in advance of that, and then he just sees things incredibly clearly. So like he actually basically does describe like Twitter mobs descending upon somebody who is judged to have incurred against offended against unwritten but absolutely absolute new social mores. Only in his case it's actual physical violence, and these things he invents commercial air travel as a science fiction reality. It's absolutely incredible. He does all these kinds of things. So that book is this incredibly rich exploration of like how technology runs the risk of like emptying out the actual worth of humanity by like tempting people to like not pay attention to their own dignity, the dignity of others, and these kinds of things. And so in the end, for him, science fiction becomes a medium for actually thinking about the end of the world as not using the kind of like elaborate prophetic language of the Book of Revelation, but using like the contemporary allegorical language of like science, technology, infinite destruction, bombs that can destroy the world, these kinds of things. And it works. it works. Like he pulls it off, and this is an absolutely brilliant sort of invention of a genre, invention of a way of looking at the modern world that gives a very profound warning to the modern world just before everything goes catastrophically to the dogs with World War One and Two.
Right. I'm interested that you're saying it's an invention of the genre though, because I've been looking at what sci-fi looked like in other time periods. Um, and I think it's fair to say that any Western sci-fi prior to the Reformation would obviously just be kind of Catholic sci-fi de facto, and there is kind of medieval science fiction. It's not just medieval fantasy stuff, right? It's the invention of the alchemist makes the automaton, or Joe Rohde, who's like kind of a rock star in Walt Disney Imagineering and an art historian in his own right, kind of leads this art history class via his Instagram, and he was showing these really cool sketches from the 1300s that had been done of what the future city would look like. And
Nice.
I mean, it was definitely, it looked like New York. I mean, it was like huge skyscrapers and everything, except that architecturally it was all Gothic architecture. So there were these beautiful,
The
sculptural
glory days.
elements on everything, castles that went thousands of feet high and everything else. I mean, it was a pretty canny look at what the future would look like, except through the lens of what those people valued architecturally. So it's interesting to me that you're saying that your particular example here is a starting point of sorts for the genre, when there are certainly glimmers of the genre before then. Can you elaborate on that? I'm interested in your thoughts
That's an
there.
interesting question. I mean, I think in terms of like full on fiction narratives that are using this kind of like look into technology to understand the human being better. Um, I don't think you really get anything like that until in that fully conceived way until um, like the Industrial Revolution,
I see.
basically. And like because you like yes, you're right. There are these interesting. I mean, obviously there is tons of like absolutely fascinating medieval science and engineering and sort of speculative engagement with those things that are really, really fascinating. Um, but I'm not aware of that really worked out into a whole kind of like world of thought in that plays out around you as a story
I see. Okay.
until like because it has to have some sort of purchase in the mind, right? And I think until the industrial like after the Industrial Revolution, and especially like this wave of kind of like the mid to late 19th century, uh the capacity of human made artifacts and technologies to both like build up and utterly eviscerate the human person are just not clear. Like they're not these absolutely gripping, literally life or death kind of desperate questions that people have to ask until like the end of the 19th century when it's an absolute crisis. So I think that's sort of when you really begin to see science fiction not just as like occasional speculative engagements with like some interesting questions, but more like a really kind of life and death engagement with like what does it actually mean to be a human being in these kinds of circumstances.
So, do you think that, I mean, the one example you brought up so far of what you'd consider Catholic sci-fi probably speaks to this, although I haven't read it, so you'd be able to correct me if I'm wrong. But do you feel like sci-fi, there's an inherent kind of existential cynicism, or at least wariness, where you're looking down the barrel of a gun a little bit with the narrative, or do you feel like that doesn't
Hmm.
have to be the case?
It doesn't have to be the case. There definitely is a lot of science fiction that is that way. A lot of contemporary science fiction is predicated on like it begins with like ecological disaster of some kind or another, or like a lot of the motive force of some kind of pressure of ecological collapse or something like that. So I mean, there's definitely a lot of science fiction that operates from this kind of like real existential pressure of like imminent destruction of some kind or another. A lot of science fiction from like the 60s, the kind of high Cold War era is basically gonna be like Soviets versus Americans, playing out in some dramatic kind of way. Um, so like yes, it's often responding to like the sort of most dramatic pressures in the society at the moment, but it doesn't have to. Like there is very optimistic, sort of like chipper science fiction as well. That's just sort of like, let's do it better. Whee!
I would love to hear some
but yeah.
examples of then the other kinds of things that you would consider falling into this realm of Catholic sci-fi. What some of your other favorites are then?
Well, so there is then this whole world. So Robert Hugh Benson, he's just this unicum, this one off. He writes a ton of novels, but basically this is the one in this kind of science fiction thing. He doesn't really have any predecessors, and he doesn't really have any immediate followers. Um, but then in America, you get this really interesting dynamic in like the 50s going into the 60s, which is that like um, post World War II, Catholicism has like made it culturally. I mean, this is something we should talk about more expansively at some point, but like a huge part of the shape of American Catholicism at the present moment is the what was happening in the 50s and 60s, when basically everyone kind of comes back from World War II, and then there's just like growth and social prosperity, and Catholics sort of finally feel like we've made it, we're relevant, we don't have to keep like proving ourselves,
Yeah,
proving that we're really Americans,
we're not the
like
drunken
proving that we're
minority, yeah, all that kind of thing.
yeah, exactly. Like we are just Americans. We are Catholic Americans. We are American Catholics. Like all of that stuff. And there's this. I mean, again, like this is where you're getting like Fulton Sheen is like on like major TV,
Bing Crosby
and
is
like
doing weird priest romantic comedy musicals.
exactly like that's exactly. This is such a fascinating period in American Catholicism where like it's a kind of triumphalism about like we've made it, we're here. Like people build these big dramatic churches that say like we're here to stay, and like main streets in cities and stuff like that. Like would this no more know nothings like it's always like trying a little bit. It's often trying a little bit too hard to
Me,
prove that like we're just here now. But okay,
methinks the
fine.
lady doth protest too much. Yeah.
Indeed, yes. One interesting way that plays out is that of course, this is a time period when this is a real like kind of American Catholic literature explosion at this period, like the 50s and 60s. Huge boom for this in general. But one under reflected aspect of that is the growth of this kind of Catholic science fiction that now is not necessarily written by Catholics or for Catholics, but is basically engaging with this question of like Catholicism as like we're here, we've made it, like deal with it, as a cultural force now blasted into some kind of future.
Okay.
So like we accept this reality that like Catholicism is this major part of American society, and now like what does that look like when some one thing is different? Like we're talking about the future, or there are aliens, or both, or whatever.
Right. Yeah. It's
So
like we've stopped to take a break. We've stopped to take a breath in the desperately trying to assimilate and insert ourselves and establish respect in our given immigrant culture. And in that breath, we go, what's next? And the what next
and
manifests as science fiction.
science fiction. So let me just say there's two fascinating examples from like right around the same time period. One is from 1958, one is from 1959. The 1958 one won the Hugo Award, which is the big science fiction award. Early on, I think the Hugo was founded in like the early 50s. I forget when. So it was one of the first winners of the Hugo, and it's called A Case of Conscience by James Blish. This book is, not to put too fine a point on it, terrible.
I was gonna joke. A Case of Conscience by James Blish. Just when you say that title, sounds just god awful. So I'm really glad that I'm right.
There's a reason why it sounds that way, because it is. So, but you'll see. Let me just describe it. You'll see how this could literally only have ever been written in this very strange, like 15 to 20 year moment in American Catholic history, where like Catholics were very big, prominent in the social scene, and people kind of wanted to think about them. It didn't mean that they liked them, but they wanted to think about them in some kind of a way. So,
Mm.
what Blish does, this novel is about Jesuits in space, basically. Just kidding, they're mostly on the Earth, but it's about like. So it's the future. We've made some kind of contact with this alien species, and the idea is that this alien species appears to be unfallen, and they appear to be just naturally good.
Oh, when you say
Like they're
unfallen
not.
for our listeners, you mean like they, according to like the Genesis narrative, they never fell from grace with God. They didn't sin. So this is a
They
race.
appear not to have original sin.
Okay.
But they are also not. They also don't know God. So
Oh,
they are neither blessed nor damned. And
I
like the
believe
idea
I
is
believe
like
the Zoomers on the internet would call that blessed and cursed.
they are blurst. Yeah, we be blurst. Yeah, and the whole idea of this is that this Jesuit casuist. So casuistry is this notion of moral theology that was particularly made popular by the Jesuits. That's why it's a case of conscience. Casuist is a theory of cases. That this Jesuit is tasked by like the Pope question mark exclamation point to like solve this difficult case. Like, how is it possible to have a species of rational creatures that is neither damned and fallen, like fallen from grace, nor in grace? So you have just these like rational creatures living a purely natural good,
Mm-hmm.
with no orientation to or away from God. Um, Spoiler alert: after a lot of pretty uninteresting and theologically garbage reflection on this, our Jesuit comes to the conclusion that this is theologically impossible, and so they must be demons.
Oh,
And so he exorcises them, and their planet blows up.
so he's right that they're demons?
Um,
Because I was assuming that this was going to be like, oh, the stupid Catholic thinks of everything as demons. But if the planet blows up, that's sort of evidentiary that maybe he was right.
Well, he does it in this very hilarious way where like the Earth authorities are also like engaging with these critters, and they're like, "Oh no, alien critters be bad," and then they decide like, you know what, we're gonna blow these guys up because like
Oh, I
alien critters
see.
be bad. And so like they send these rocket ships to obliterate the alien homeworld, and then like now our Jesuit, our future Jesuit is now actually a space Jesuit because he goes to the moon. Don't ask why. And then he like exorcises them from the moon. Don't ask why. And he realizes that like in like God's cosmic timing that like he has just done this, but like by the time that like the light waves or something get there, that like the ships will have gotten there and blown up the planet, and like God is using these ships as like instrumental causality to like achieve the reality of the exorcism, which is to blow them up. Anyway, like I said, this book is kind of garbage. He apparently wrote it's the start of a trilogy because he was very excited about it, and then he wrote two more. I have not had the heart to read the other two, because the first one is, I'm gonna be frank, not good, but it is such a fascinating reflection on like just the place of Catholicism in the middle of the century, because you see like Catholics like do not come out well in this, but they're also shown to be like super, like they kind of take human beings really seriously, but they also take them maybe too seriously, and they're like super logical, but maybe they're too logical, and maybe they're wrapped up in their own like false theological thinking, but also maybe what they're doing has real effects in the world, and maybe it's like just another way of describing what science does without God, or maybe it's different. It's kind of marvelous as like a cultural artifact. It's really kind of a fantastic book.
I really like what you're saying here, though, because you're right. I mean, it's something that I never consciously recognized, but now that you're saying it, I really resonate with it. That when Catholicism is depicted in a sci-fi lens, it's saying something about how that present culture views spirituality. It's funny. This is sort of a good microcosm of how all our conversations go, because you're coming in hot with some of these very deep cut kind of literary references, and then I'm responding with pretty ridiculous pop culture references. But I'm thinking of everything from, there was a reboot of an 80s show. I don't know if the 80s show had this, but I know that the reboot did. It was called V, and it was about.
Oh yeah, V. Yeah,
Did you
yeah,
watch
yeah,
the
yeah.
reboot of V?
I watched part of it until it became unwatchably bad. But yes, I
It was
did.
pretty much
Yeah.
always unwatchably bad, but I really liked
Facts.
that, like, right in there as one of the major characters was this Catholic priest struggling with the ethics of, converting the aliens and dealing with the aliens. And then, you know, ultimately the bureaucrats of the Vatican end up, spoiler alert for anybody who's going to go back and watch V, but the bureaucrats,
Literally nobody.
right,
That's a null set.
the
Actually,
bureaucrats of the Vatican end up kind of giving in to blackmail and threats from the evil aliens. And so this priest is the one, like, he stays faithful, but he's basically excommunicated, and so he has to kind of live, he has to figure out, like, what living as a priest when your church has abandoned you, and, like, still sticking by his faith in regards to, like, hey, these aliens are up to no good. It was a really interesting examination for a network TV, like, sci-fi alien show. But then, other examples that come to mind, I know Doctor Who is well beloved by many, historically a pretty hardcore atheistic show, but when they did the 11th Doctor, which was two actors ago now, Matt Smith was the actor who played that incarnation of the Doctor, or that iteration of the Doctor, and they had some really cool subplots with Catholicism, some favorable, some unfavorable, but one of the best ones was actually in what many people think is the, like, best episode from the entire series, in which they go a couple hundred years into the future, and the Catholic Church has evolved into primarily a paramilitary organization, where, and not a bad one either. They protect space travelers, and the military levels are equal to the church levels. So, like, the general is the bishop, and then he has 48 clergy under his command, and they are storming in, and it's sort of like a sci-fi Templar thing. But that even is really respectful and really cool, and they have some fun where they, like, briefly mention that there was frustrations and tensions between this one alien race and the Catholic Church, because this alien race had two heads and they wanted to be able to marry each other, and the church said that was wrong.
Ha! That's okay. That's actually legit. That is legit.
No, there were some good things. And then I also, so those are, like, the two, like, serious examples I'm thinking of. And then there's some, like, really ridiculous examples I'm thinking of. Like, I know The Walking Dead has a priest character who's trying to experience what faith is in a world where 98% of people are zombies, and what if God has abandoned us. And then Firefly has a Catholic priest character that's pretty cool.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Well, I mean, he's not. I guess it's sort of a Church of Crystal Dragon Jesus thing, but he's very obviously a Catholic.
Like I said, Catholic priest.
Right? Yeah, exactly. No, you've never heard that phrase before. That's like when in sci-fi or fantasy there is an obvious parallel for Catholicism, but they just don't call it that. So it's like they all wear the vestments, and they, they're often like the villains or whatever. Like the in Golden Compass.
I was going to say, you mean the Golden Compass, where the enemy is literally called the Magisterium.
Right. The Magisterium would be a perfect example of the trope, and this is actually formally called the Church of the Crystal Dragon Jesus. Because it's such a common,
that is amazing
trope. But I think my favorite stupid Catholic sci-fi thing is in Sharknado 3.
Oh,
where
now this might surprise you to know that although I have seen with great joy Sharknado, I sadly have not been able to watch its great sequels 2 and 3.
Well, there are many
So-
more than just 2 and 3, but 3 is the one you have to watch from a Catholic sci-fi perspective, because even if you disagree that Sharknado is sci-fi, it's on the Sci-Fi Network, so it has to be sci-fi, and
contractually
obligated to be technically science fiction, and it is sort of like the Sharknado Euro trip kind of a thing, where like they're going to like different European countries and saving like the Queen from sharks and everything, and they have to protect the Pope from sharks.
Classic.
And the Pope is played by none other than Fabio.
Stop it. Oh my gosh. Okay, how did they get the budget to get Fabio out of retirement to do anything? Because these movies are made for like $20 in a hot dog.
Right, yeah.
But apparently, actually, as I'm saying that, when was the last time somebody paid Fabio for anything?
I think just the Can't Believe It's Not Butter commercials. So I think he would do it for $20 on a hot dog. But also, when other time is Fabio going to get the chance to play the Pope?
Fact,
right? Like
fact,
if I'm Fabio
actually.
and I have been sort of typecast and maligned for being handsome my entire life,
is it my fault?
Right? Is it my fault that I am beautiful? And someone then gets in touch with me and says, "Hey, do you want to play the Pope and punch a shark?" I'm going to do that for free. I'll pay you to do that.
Yeah, and then they say, "Oh, good, actually, because we didn't have any budget to pay you, and you're gonna have to fly us to Rome because we don't have the money for that."
Right.
Yeah, that'll be great. Thanks, Fabio. It'll be fantastic. Also, Fabio, are you Austrian or Italian or what are you?
What are you exactly, other than hit by a goose in the face? What are you exactly?
Exactly. That's amazing. No, yeah, that's right. So there is this kind of fascinating stuff that like these things kind of float in and around. The other like 50s one I was going to talk about, but I'm actually going to cut myself off on that one, was going to be Canticle for Leibowitz, because that is actually a great treasure of 20th century American literature that we should talk about some other time.
Yeah, I kind of want to do a whole. I suspected you would get into Canticle of Leibowitz, but I kind of want to do a whole episode on that book. So
yeah, we'll talk about Canticle later. But just one last word for me on this. So skipping way forward to like basically the present. In like 2010, 2014, maybe, I forget exactly, this guy, contemporary author named Michael Flynn, wrote a book called Eifelheim, that it's just, so aliens show up in 14th century Black Forest, Germany. Go. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. The whole book is a question about like, what is a person? Just what does it mean to be a person? And so are these aliens persons? If they are persons, can they be baptized? Do they need to be baptized? All of this. It's like the very, very, very theologically and dramatically serious version of what The Case of Conscience wanted to be, but was like too sort of like wrapped up in itself to be. Eifelheim is not a super well written book. It has real difficulties, but it's, his basic thought is that he wants to work out like what in all seriousness, like a lot of science fiction wants to answer this question, what does it mean to be a person? A lot of the best science fiction is doing that kind of thing. And he just basically came to the conviction that the Catholic theology in like the 13th and 14th century had better ability to answer the question of what a person is than human thought ever since. And so he just says like, what if this happened? What if this happened, and you were dealing with medieval society as real medieval society, not some like fantasy world version of it. And you really had aliens, and then you really had Catholic priests who weren't like, oh my gosh, aliens, monsters, but they like actually had to ask these serious questions like, okay, monsters, cool, great. Now, next question, this seems to be rational. So Jesus? And it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's so serious. Like it takes things. It's just earnest, Like it actually really takes things in legit earnest and handles them exceptionally, like really, really fascinatingly well. So again, I really not a literary treasure, but a really interesting work and a really interesting take on just like now interesting in contrast to Blish, who was writing who didn't respect Catholicism really, but was writing when Catholicism was really big culturally. Now Flynn is writing with a lot of respect for Catholicism when Catholicism is culturally irrelevant in the present. And so he jumps back to the past to to so that he can engage with this in a really rich way, and it totally works, and it's really fascinating.
That's okay. You've sold me on this particular book. Do me a favor though, and to kind of land the plane here on this particular topic of yours. We're sort of describing all of these our favorite guilty pleasures in the arts with, as I said at the opening of this episode, the pretense that there is something deeper in anything that we find ourselves called to aesthetically, that if we explore it thoroughly leads us back to God, and if we explore it together leads us closer to each other. To land that plane, help us all understand here for the listener who maybe is a big fan of sci-fi but isn't Catholic, or for the listener who's super religious but just has no interest in science fiction at all. What does this mean to you on a personal level, and why should someone like one of those two people check this stuff out?
Well, it's because what science fiction does when it's really hopping is it lets us see ourselves, see the real situation in which we live, by imagining our real selves with just a little bit changed. And so, um, some of these authors, particularly the really good, I mean, the ones that are genuinely good on their own terms, what they let you do is actually see yourself as like um, a man unto God explored, in this very rich way, So it's using the strength of literature, using the way in which literature works in the human person, using the particular strength of what science fiction does when it's doing its thing the very best, and then it does this kind of genre that I'm thinking about, does this with the specific lens of wanting to look at the way that the human person is oriented towards God, and exploring that by means of the kind of allegorical languages that are intuitive to our time, which is basically science fiction.
I love that. That's really
Yeah.
cool. That's really, really cool. Well, for those of you listening, go check out your local Catholic SciFi, I guess.
Do it. All right, but enough from me. Why don't we move on to? I said smooth. Let's move on to.
Let's move on to.
Let's move on down to your number one.
Yeah, my number one. Drum roll, please.
That's not drum roll. That's just me going.
Is it's Circus. The idea of Circus itself. And I'll say two things to kind of intro us on Circus. The reason this is a guilty pleasure is because I know how many people hate it.
Excellent.
And I won't deny, I'll admit my bias, that that's part of why I love it. I fall into the trap, unfortunately, but awaredly, I fall into the trap that so many hipsters do, and unfortunately so many white male Catholics do, which is, if there is something that the culture overall deems as detestable to a degree that like their ire almost seems irrational, I immediately go and say, I should probably look into that a little bit more.
I love this like crazy. You know what I love? This 100%.
Right.
Absolutely.
But,
yes.
And Circus definitely counts for that, right? I mean, the majority of people out there think it's sort of an abominable, outdated institution, gritty, dirty, abusive, these kinds of things, which, as a Catholic, that all sounds very homey to me. but my love of Circus goes well beyond just being kind of rebellious for rebellion's sake. I was introduced to Circus very, very early. My family was extremely poor when I was a kid, but would kind of take advantage once a year of, I guess, the homeschool deals that would be offered for tickets for the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. And I was just completely enchanted. And I would go to the library and get every single possible book on the history of circus and, the great acrobats from the 1800s and the animal trainers from the 20s and, these circus dynasty families that went back. And as I did that, I encountered this really, really incredibly beautiful world that I think says a lot, in the same way that you're saying that sci-fi studies the human person and tries to look deeper. I think Circus, however inadvertently, explicitly displays the potential of the human person. And in some ways that's obvious, right? The physical potential of the human person is made very explicit with acrobatics and daredevils and things like that, right? We're pushing our humanity and our mortality to its extreme. But on a much more existential, much more moral level, there's this really beautiful icon of what's best about humanity, I think, to be found in Circus. In preparation for this episode, I dug up this quote that I love. Whenever Ringling Brothers closed down a few years ago, which I can talk about more, but whenever it finally kind of gave up the goat and closed down a few years ago, this was a statement released by a very famous UK-based animal trainer called Jim Clubb. It's a longer sentiment, but I think it summarizes exactly how I feel about Circus and what it says about humanity. He says, think of a society that on a political basis is both the capitalistic and the socialist's dream. Think of a society that employed ex-slaves ahead of everyone else, and by its very nature is multicultural. Think of a society that has a hierarchy and even a system ingrained in culture and tradition, and yet opened its doors to absolutely anyone who was willing to work hard and provide them with the realistic dream of climbing to the top of their professional tree. Think of a society that always provided equal opportunities for men and women. A society that had a woman heading a strong family business years before women had the equal vote. Think of a society that provided highly profitable employment and success for the disabled when the rest of society only offered poverty or the workhouse. Think of a society that brought animals from all over the world to people who never knew they existed and further worked with institutions that to this day work to conserve those very species. Think of a society that, through exposing people to said animals, brought awareness of said animals' plight in the wild. Think of a culture that entertained audiences of all classes and all creeds. Think of a culture that takes the form of a global family, accepting leaders as equals of any sex, race, religion, philosophical position, sexual orientation, or moderate political persuasion. Think of an institution that boasted the economy. That boosted the economy, never asked for government support or public funding, that worked off their own steam and integrated themselves into every community they visited, often providing job opportunities. Think of a society that built buildings over a century ago that still stand today and brought elements that are part of the very fabric of modern entertainment. Then imagine if that culture is shunned by the country that invented it and suffers fashionable prejudice. Imagine if said society's very name prompts disdain to such a degree that it has become accepted as a noun for general lawlessness. These are my people. This is Circus.
Wow, that's intense. That's amazing.
I have more to say here, but I would just love your initial knee-jerk thoughts on that sentiment, because as a Catholic, that sentiment resonates the hell out of me.
Oh yeah, oh for sure. And like help me understand, the idea is that like the circus is bad because like animals.
Well, animals, history. I mean, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when circus was really taking off in this country, there was some, racial stuff that went in there that was, by modern standards, definitely problematic. I think a great example of this is that, and please forgive me for using dated racial language here, listener, but like the original touring run of Ringling Brothers, P.T. Barnum featured a woman who ostensibly proclaimed to be George Washington's mammy, and that she was
Okay.
112 years old, and it was and when she would sing kind of slave songs and things like this. And so people point to that and some other depictions of black people as very problematic. The flip side of that, of course, is that she was a free slave woman who'd been doing this performance on her own in small theaters for years as a way to fund her emancipation. And P.T. Barnum discovered her and said, let me contract with you on an equal level to all my other performers and, basically do a theatrical run of you with the circus. So, like, you can say, yeah, could you argue that Circus, like, proclaimed or promoted racist sensibilities? Sure. But I don't want to take the kind of, oh, they're a product of their time model, but I think they were the best of their time. The same thing with how quote unquote freaks were treated, right? There's kind of the cliche of John Merrick, the Elephant Man, and people taunting the freak and things like that. And in established circuses, I mean, look, there are certainly lowbrow carnivals, and there's certainly bad people in every organization, right? Again, as a Catholic, I'm pretty good at being able to love an organization for the values it seeks to uphold, not necessarily the people who fail to uphold it within the organization. Sure. But when you actually read what John Merrick said about his own experience, the Elephant Man said about his own experience, he loved working in the circus. Everybody was nice to him there. Awesome. It was when the doctors took him and started like doing medical presentations on him that he started the whole "I am a human being, respect me" thing. Sure, I am not a monster. I am a human being, right? Like science was kind of the thing that maimed him, not circus. And in general, if you look at the experience of so-called freaks throughout the 20th century in the circus, it was really a home for these people, to again, as the statement from Jim Clubb said, like, these are Black people and Asian people and Native American people and Irish people and conjoined twins and women with beards and morbidly obese people and giants and little people all living together as equals and being paid equally and marrying each other. There's a famous case of like the most famous conjoined twin. They actually depicted him in the Hugh Jackman movie The Greatest Showman, where these two brothers who were conjoined married two acrobat sisters in the circus. Oh my gosh. And but it was a very open, welcoming community that in the 1800s and 1900s was just not around anywhere else. But it wasn't just about, and I think this next point, and then you're of course right that people are like, oh, they're mean to animals. But again, I mean, yes, are there small, per Tiger King on Netflix, are there small animal places, traveling shows, carnivals, quote unquote roadside zoos that are insanely abusive to animals? Yeah, of course there are, and those need to be regulated, and from both a legal and a religious moral standpoint. I mean, Benedict talked a lot about animal welfare and things like this, and we obviously should fight that wherever it happens. But within mainline established circuses, these are people who have lived and worked with these same families of animals, the human family and the animal family working parallel for 10 generations. These are guys who like the majority of elephants in the circus come from like 4 or 5 generations of elephants who have worked in the circus, and
that's
their elephant grandparents worked with the trainer's granddad, and like I'm thinking of several lion tamers who like sleep in the cage with their lions most nights because the lions will like get scared of the thunder, or they need to like establish a closer relationship with the lions. And so there's this almost this almost Edenic, like of Eden kind of relationship between the good animal trainers and their animals, because any parent knows this. If you want something to obey you, you actually can't abuse and beat it. Especially if it is, 1,000 pounds with razor sharp teeth. Like, you need to build rapport with that creature in order for it to obey you. So the myth of like somebody kind of taking a whip and beating a lion or an elephant into submission is kind of just demonstratively and obviously just that, a myth, because you can't get a creature like that to obey you for more than 10 minutes if you're actually mistreating it. So in general, there's within the confines of circus itself, this really kind of, again, Edenic, of Eden either foreshadowing or post-shadowing, whatever, of what it looks like to be fully in communion with each other as human beings and in communion with nature, in a way that many artistic communities and cults and religions have tried to perfect and ultimately failed. Circus has done better. But it's not just in the community, it is, as that statement said, it actively reaches out, one, to other people outside the community to join it, and two, it actively serves people outside of that community. The circus was really revolutionary as an American art form because it traveled, and it said no matter how
Hmm.
poor and uneducated and rural you are, you deserve beauty and education.
Right.
And so we're
Right.
going to go to this town with 3 houses in it, and we're going to pull in and set up our tents, and you're going to see a tiger. You didn't even know a tiger was an animal. You're going to see
Right.
an Asian person for the first time in your life. You're going to see a free black man making a living. You're going to, and you're going to be educated and uplifted and inspired by that, in a way that was not relegated to the 1800s. I I'll talk more about my experience here with this, but Carson and Barnes is the largest remaining tent circus in the country. They have not
Oh,
closed
cool.
down, and they Ringling Brothers, before they closed down, had moved to an arena model where they would come into like hockey stadiums and stuff like that.
Hmm.
But Carson and Barnes still like comes into town, mostly illegal immigrants, and sets up like a tent and then leaves the next
Nice.
day before anything can be caught, and like really legit badass black tar, mainline circus. Um, but they they when they came to the town I grew up in, which is very much a kind of one horse town, um, the mayor like came to greet them. And they were there for one night, and like all these people were like, I feel so honored that our town was a place this circus deemed worthy to visit.
That's
And like literally
amazing.
like, we're
Yeah,
like
that's
quoted in like
awesome.
news stories where like, I wonder if this will put our town on the map. And like obviously it
That's
wouldn't have
awesome.
done, right? It wouldn't put your town on the map. But the fact that something this big and this beautiful came to me makes me have to recognize on a personal level, on a local level, on a community level, that I have dignity and I have worth, because otherwise these beautiful, amazing things would not have chosen me to reveal themselves to me. And so on every level, I just see there's this really beautiful kind of existential, phenomenological, mystical thing that's not hard to perceive in circus if you look at it for more than 5 minutes. And that's just leaving aside my personal experiences with the medium. But everything you're saying about sci-fi trying to examine the human person, I think circus just inadvertently does.
That's awesome. That does actually sounds really beautiful. I read a book by is a German man who is of Syrian origin, I believe. So he's an immigrant to Germany as an adult, and but he writes in German, and he wrote this really actually lovely novel about uh a circus master who like um goes to unnamed Middle Eastern who's like this he goes to some unnamed Middle Eastern country and is funded by an old acquaintance from like way back who is now extremely wealthy to like run a whole circus for him and like go all over these teeny little towns in this little country and you discover as it's going along that like this wealthy donor who's funding the whole thing is like dying of cancer or something and that like the thing that he wanted to do with all of his money at the end of his life was to give his like poverty and war torn people the joy of being able to live this reality of the beauty of the circus. And honestly, I found it to be a very inspiring book. Like it's very moving. Its presentation of the circus. It's a little bit optimistic, um, but but it's very beautiful actually. And it is kind of connecting with some of these dynamics of like expansion of the human person, the invitation to beauty, and the like. the sacrifice for beauty and all of these things that you're proposing, which it's really interesting.
And again, I mean, I don't want to paint over the genuinely bad things that have occasionally, happened in circus. I mean, historically, with some of the race stuff that happened, there certainly are notable cases where animals have been mistreated. I mean, even up to recently, Big Apple Circus had kind of its own Me Too moment. So like people have genuinely suffered sometimes within circus, as people have genuinely suffered within any human institution. But I think when I don't know, you were referencing sort of cancel culture before in your talk about sci-fi, and I think in our present society, we are constantly weighing the goodness of a thing based on the bad that it's done. And I sort of take it on credit that everybody does crap all the time, and everybody's kind of bad, and everybody's kind of messed up. And so I personally try to weigh institutions, organizations, and people not based on the bad things they've done, but on the good that they ultimately aspire to do. And I'm hard pressed to think of a organization or an institution that aspired to do as good a thing as circus has historically aspired to do and got as close to succeeding as it did.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. Now, explain to me why, normally people say things like, I'm going to run off and join the circus. So, dropping the article makes it sound like we're giving it a kind of sort of like conceptual cachet here. Like, is there a principle behind
circus
dropping articles?
Yeah, circus people tend to just refer to it as circus, right? If you say the circus, you're joining a specific circus, but that's not how. But circuses, they contract with their individual performers. So like if you go see Ringling, and there might be a particular clown there for 2 years, right? But then he'll get a contract with Carson and Barnes and work there for 2 years. So there's this really cool kind of global community of circus performers where they really do all know each other. There's a bar in just outside of Cincinnati where you and I met each other called Circus. It's a brewery founded by former circus performers, specifically the clown car driver from Ringling Brothers. And they have, through some very weird legal loopholes, been able to grant work visas to people from over 290 countries into their bar to just come and perform things there. And these are all just people they personally know.
That's insane.
That's kind of it really does defy kind of global geographical borderlines in a really, really cool way. And again, there's always weirdness and there's always badness in everything. There's always, spots of mold on the bread, but I'm really always moved by that on a macro level. And on a micro level too, I went to see, I took some friends to see the Shriners Circus like 2 years ago, which is funny because, we're Catholics, and of course the Shriners are essentially Freemasons. So at the end of the show, all the performers in the circus line up down the hallway, and they like applaud you as you're leaving the theater, and they shake your hand and everything. And I joked with my buddy Kyle, who is the producer on this podcast. He shook the hand of one of the clowns, and I said, by doing that, you just renounced the Pope and became a Freemason.
No.
but all kidding aside, it was amazing because we're sitting in the stands, and these motorcycle guys come out and they're driving around in circles in the motorcycle cage, 6 different motorcycles in this round cage, going around each other, and very death defying and everything. And not 3 minutes after that act, suddenly that motorcycle guy is next to us in our row selling us popcorn.
That's amazing.
And
that's
the
amazing.
acrobat chick is like sweeping up the poop behind the horse. And and what you realize is like everybody is doing everything. Like it is fully all hands on deck. Nobody is better than anybody else. I was actually offered a position as ringmaster in Carson and Barnes Circus about 10 years ago.
Amazing.
And my parents got mad and I didn't take it. I was too young and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, they offered me at least to try out for it, and one of the stipulations was you had to be able to drive a semi truck.
That's
Like
amazing.
just because
Yeah.
you're the ringmaster doesn't mean you're not going to be hauling equipment, you know. And I think that's so
amazing.
cool. That's so
Yeah, that is cool.
Where else in society? It's not like the president of the United States is going to war alongside, you know, privates in the military. You know, it's not like, you know, unfortunately, most, you know, big top religious leaders aren't tending to be in the trenches with their people very often. It's a problem. But the ringmaster is hauling equipment at the circus, and I think that's so
awesome.
beautiful.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you ever gotten to do any like circusy things or see any of that stuff?
I have been to a circus once when I was a kid, and it was really great.
Do you remember which one it
Yeah,
was or what stood out to
no.
you about the experience at all?
No, not really. I remember being impressed by the acrobats, and that's pretty much what I remember. But it was neat. I mean, I really liked it. Was really happy to be able to do it.
Well, it's, you know, there's a Catholic connection here as well. And maybe you'll get to meet some of these guys at some point, but, in most countries, certainly in Europe, the different bishops' conferences of different countries, the establishment of the Catholic Church in different countries, will have a specific office just for traveling peoples.
Oh yeah,
Romani,
sure, yeah.
sometimes, you know, referred to as gypsies, although that is technically a slur. But you know, they will have these offices for those people because those people tend to be very historically Catholic and still live outside the margins of society and face a ton of persecution. In America, we have that same obligatory office, but it is for circus here. And so,
You know, actually, come to think of it, I think when I was a deacon, I preached for a circus.
how did you
It was
forget this?
Yeah.
How
Well,
is this a
'cause in the
come to
end, the
think of
only
it?
yeah, come to think of it. Well, because the only people who came were these like it was this music like a group of like high school singers, and it was a little embarrassing. But I had that's right because I had been really hoping to preach to uh circus people, but in the end it was just these like high school singers, which was like fine, they're people too, but you know there weren't any acrobats or giants or little people, and I was sad about
Oh,
that.
that's sad.
Yeah. Yes.
But
Yes.
no, it's pretty amazing because, um yeah, no, there are priests and nuns dedicated to traveling with circuses and serving their spiritual needs. I got to interview Father Frank Cancro a couple of years ago, who is one of the official United States chaplains for the Office of Circus, and travels with them and does masses in the ring and does baptisms for the families. And again, most of these are, you know, immigrant peoples from Italy and France and, you know, you know, Russia, and these are deeply faithful people, and, you know, who are traveling on the road and are doing shows on Sundays and can't go to church. And so, you know, these priests kind of travel with them. And he told me a story. He said I asked him what his coolest like circus priest moment was. And he said someone came up to him and said like, "Hey man, I really need a confession. Do you have like 5 minutes to give a confession?" Which is, you know, a common experience for most priests, except that the only quiet place they could steal away to was next to the tiger cage. And so literally
That's
Father Frank like
amazing.
had his back against the bars. A tiger is breathing down his neck as he's absolving this guy. And he said it was such a powerful witness of, for him, he said it was a powerful witness of, you know, the whole idea like Satan as the prowling lion, and he's rescuing this guy from that guilt, and here's the prowling big cat behind him. And there's just, it was a really cool like spiritual liturgical moment for him. And they're cool
That is
guys,
so
man. They're really
amazing.
cool. And I
Yeah.
love that there is this Catholic connection. You know, this is ultimately an art podcast, and I'm going to post some of this art to our Instagram. But there's this whole article I found in Retablos on different Catholic icons, painted by circus performers who have had visceral spiritual experiences on the show floor. So like there's one of this this guy who's like I guess he's a daredevil or something, and he had an experience in the ring where he was about to die from a stunt gone wrong, and he claims to have seen the Virgin Mary and like credits her with his healing. There's a guy who painted his own experience for Saint for like reading the story of Daniel in the lion's den when he was a kid, and that made him want to be a lion tamer, and so he paints like an icon of incredible. Daniel like watching over him. There's a guy who I really like this narrative specifically. He said, I thank Saint Genesius. This is a clown writing this. He says, I thank Saint Genesius, patron saint of actors and clowns, for a day when my leg went numb and the wire, the tightrope he was walking on, got so tense that it broke. Fortunately, I landed on the floor in such a way that I didn't break anything, and I didn't even get hurt, and I credit Saint Genesius with that miracle. And so there's these really beautiful Mexican folk art type paintings of these different personal kind of miracles that have happened to these circus performers. And I just think, again, it speaks to the explicit faith of a people who have gotten as close as I can imagine getting this side of heaven to building something not unlike the communion of saints, building something not unlike that utopia where we as human beings are able to put aside our differences and work for the greater glory of each other and the greater glory of God, and live in community and communion with nature. And even in the case of, the circus priests like Father Frank, live in community with faith and religion on the road. And I don't know, man, I'll always regret not taking that job.
Oh my gosh. No, it's true. It's true. That'll always be the road not taken. But listen, we did it. All right. We made it through our top one and our top one.
Our respective top ones.
Our respective top one would be a way to put it. And last time you were complaining that, like I recommend things and then you dig into them and then you recommend things and I never touch them. But you have sold me on the circus, So
nice.
This is exciting. I can't say I'm going to go run off and join the circus as circus priest, because I think circus priest probably needs a little bit less lifelong studenty life than I've had.
But maybe at least we can go see a show together next time we're in actually the same state.
That would be pretty amazing, actually, in fact. So listen, everybody, thanks so much for listening. It's been a great conversation. Looking forward to next time. Until then, go forth and create cool things.
This has been Created Things, an art, soul, and mind production with Jacob Flores Popchak and Father Gabriel Torretta. Production by Kyle Meineke and Jessica Flores. Theme song by Federico Carranza. For more on the podcast and on its hosts, visit artsoulandmind.com.